Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores our human condition. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We talk with researchers and other interesting people to unlock the mysteries of our behavior by using a behavioral science lens.
The mysteries. I love it, Tim. I love how you extenuate the mysteries that we have.
Mysteries.
Okay, but before we get to our cool conversation for this episode, let's hear from some listeners, Tim. We've had some very nice things written about us, and I think it might be good to share them with everyone, or at least it just strokes our egos.
Well, I agree to both, actually. Well, let's first hear from a reviewer based in the U.S., and I think the pronunciation of the name of this reviewer is Spate de Great, but
yeah,
I
that's
could be wrong on that. SP8DAGR8. Spate de Great. I think that'd be right. Yeah, there you go. I think that's right, but I could be totally wrong on it. Anyway, okay. This person wrote, enlightening and fun. Kurt, Tim, and their guests always make me think and consider something I hadn't before. Plus, the guys are really good-natured and have fun. Good podcast I always look forward to.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah.
Although, obviously, they don't know us because they say we're good-natured. So
Totally.
They must not really listen to the show if they, it's like, or we just fool people. I don't know. Maybe we just have them fooled.
Maybe that's it. Maybe we're just really good at just concealing our true selves.
Although I will agree, I always look forward to the conversations that we have with our guests as well. So I'm glad that they feel the same. But next, we have another one. And next, we want to share a cool comment. And again, this is from another great handle, Accidental B-Sci, who's also in the United States. And they state, always insightful. I always find Tim and Kurt's conversation and interviews insightful and inspiring. The caliber and breadth of guests is truly great. I love the grooving sessions between Tim and Kurt at the end of each episode. They help crystallize the main takeaways from each interview. On the con side, my reading list keeps getting longer and longer as I want to dive further into many of the insights shared. Emoji, winking, smiling face.
I was a little worried when they got to the con side.
Me too.
Right?
Oh my God. Oh, what did we do?
Yeah, but I'm glad that it's just that the reading list is getting longer. That's not bad.
Oh my gosh. I feel that pain. I mean, we got to read all those books, which I say got to, which is horrible because we get to read all of those.
Yeah.
It's like fantastic because, those books are almost always really insightful, at least have something that we can take away with. Yeah.
Very true. Hey, I just want to point out that both of these reviewers are from the United States, but more than 55% of our listeners are from outside the United States. So I think that it's time to encourage listeners who are not in the U.S. to share their thoughts with us.
All right. It sounds like a challenge. You're raising a bar here. You're saying, hey, you non-U.S. groovers, if you're listening from outside the U.S., it's time to get your voice heard and to share your review with whatever platform that you listen to Behavioral Grooves on. And even if you spell behavioral with a U, we'll take it. It's all right, Christian Hunt. Okay.
Okay. On to our guest. All right.
You didn't like that you comment, did you?
No, I like it. No, actually.
It's an inside joke we spate
it
with
is.
our...
And just for listeners, if you don't know Christian Hunt, he does the Human Risk podcast that we adore, by the way.
We adore.
And we adore Christian as well. He's just pretty terrific. But
he just always spells behavioral wrong. So that's all. That's
all right. Martin Gonzalez is the author of The Bonfire Moment. Bring your team together to solve the hardest problems startups face. He's also the creator of Google's Effective Founders Project, a global research program that decodes the factors that enable startup founders to succeed. Now, on his day job at Google, he works closely with Google's engineers and research leaders on org design, leadership, and culture challenges.
In our conversation with Martin, we discussed some of the challenges facing leaders in corporations and founders of new businesses, including culture, growth, and effective communication. A big part of this is the role that emotional intelligence plays in making leaders more effective. A key reason for this is the prevalence of imposter syndrome among startup founders and the need for creating a no bullshit relationships where founders can be themselves and share their insecurities without the fear of judgment.
We also explored myths around scaling and hierarchy in organizations and highlighted the need for a more nuanced understanding of what it means to be a leader. Martin shares some strategies for managing expectations and maximizing the enjoyable parts of work while acknowledging that 100% joy is simply unrealistic.
You know, I was kind of saddened by that because I really wanted to have 100% joy. Like we do with this podcast. It's 100% joy with you and me when we get to do this. And why can't work just be like this podcast? I don't know.
I know.
All right. So with that, we hope you sit back and relax with a boiling hot kettle of bonfire moments and enjoy our conversation with Martin Gonzalez.
Martin Gonzalez, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. We are really excited to talk to you about your new book. But of course, first, wouldn't it be better just to understand maybe the most fundamental and important thing of this whole conversation? Do you prefer coffee or tea?
Coffee, 100 times coffee.
100 times.
Wow.
Yes.
And there you are. You're actually drinking coffee right now.
Yes.
Oh, look at that. And it looks like it's black, no cream.
Well, there's stevia. I like my coffee sweet also because I love coffee so much, but I'm so caffeine sensitive. I'll do 1 cup of caffeinated and decaf all through the day just so I could have more coffee. That's how much I like it.
There you go. I like that. All right.
I like that too.
All right. We are in our speed round. So second speed round question, which is never a speed round, as people always know. If you could get a superpower for an hour, would you prefer to have flying be that superpower or being able to read people's minds?
Oh, that's so hard.
It's only an hour.
I love the look on your face. It was just, you really cringed there.
So flying, because my most joyful dreams as a child was flying. And I think one as a human being could develop the skill of reading people's minds, but you can't develop flight.
Wow.
How about that?
All right. Well, we could go a whole episode on just like reading people's minds. And there you go.
That episode
I like
will be
the flying
called,
piece.
Yeah, the existential conversation with Martin Gonzalez.
Okay, all right. So I have to dig a little deeper on the flying. Do you want like Superman flying, where you just jump and you're flying, or do you need to have wings? Do you want to have like
that is so?
You know, I mean, there's different components of flying here, right?
So I'll tell you how I fly in my dreams, which is so ridiculous. So it's a combination of I need to gain momentum by running. Then as soon as I jump, it's like I'm swimming through the air. So it's not the most graceful or superhero like flying.
Okay. People they can't see us on the podcast. We're mimicking the breathstroke.
That's right. No, and it's exactly the breaststroke. It's not the butterfly or the freestyle. No. It's the breaststroke.
Okay, which I think that there's some psychological issues going on there.
That's a perfectly psychologically perfect thing. I could see it. I like it. There you go.
All right. Okay. Let's keep moving through the speed round here. Martin, in a tech startup, is it always best for the co-founders to share power equally, 50-50?
So the answer is no. And in fact, oftentimes when that happens, it's a red flag, even for investors, that this duo probably hasn't had the hard conversation about contribution. Yeah. I should actually ask the two of you if you've shared equity or revenues of this podcast equally.
So the fun thing about this podcast is there are no real revenues. And so it's of the sharing of the cost. And I don't know, we haven't actually had that hard conversation, but it's worked out anyway.
Note to self. Let's knock that one out here, Kurt. Okay.
All right.
We'll come back to that.
Speed round question. Would it behoove leaders to treat employees more like volunteers?
Yes. It sounds like you've read a really good book on this, by the way.
Well, there is this crazy book out there, and I swear it's amazing. It's called The Bonfire Moment. Bring your team together to solve the hardest problem startups face, and it has all these great insights in it. So, which is actually, Martin, we are here to talk to you about that book. Which, oh my gosh, your name is on the cover, and look at that, you and Josh Yellen. So we're excited to be here to talk about this, and I just wanted to start. So, the bonfire moment. All right. So I when I heard that first, it was like, what? Are we starting fires? What are we doing? We getting kumbaya around the campfire? Or what is this? So can you, just for our listeners, tell us what a bonfire moment is and why would a startup or a company even care?
Yeah. So the bonfire moment is really a workshop. It's a one-day workshop that we kind of outline in the book. It's part 2 of the book. Part 1, we talk about all the many traps startups fall into systematically. But it's a one-day intense workshop. It's a bonfire moment, not a campfire moment, because it's actually not the most comfortable or relaxing one-day experience ever. We invite leaders and founding teams to really have the tough conversations. It feels a little bit like marriage counseling before, almost like the prenup stage. Like, how do we talk about, the breakup and all that? But the reason why we went with this idea of the bonfire moment is we find it in working with a lot of leaders. It's like they're constantly in the fire. It's that the intensity, that pressure cooker kind of experience. And this is the one day where they can step out of that fire and then examine it together, figure out, how might we jump back in a more effective way? How do we bandage up some of our relational wounds, kind of get back in touch with our mission? So that's the bonfire moment.
Why would they want to do this? I mean, it sounds like it's challenging.
So I'll tell you why, which is when we first actually built this workshop about 9 years ago, the Google Accelerator had all these wonderful components of it. How do you do machine learning and growth strategy and operations and all that? There was nothing on people and culture. And when I reached out to the team, because I don't sit in that team at Google, I sit in a team that supports our internal folks, our leaders and teams at Google. I said, hey, let me take a look at the research, because I think that's important. And I found, there's some heritage, there's some history of a couple of decades of research that survey venture capitalists, VCs. And as I'm think about the most recent companies that have failed in your portfolio and what are the top reasons for failure. And we found that study found that 65% of failed startups failed because of the people issues.
Yeah.
And when I found that data out, I sent it to the team and said, hey, give me a small budget. Let's pilot a small little workshop. No frills, just kind of basic workshop. Let's engage these founders on these people issues. Number 1, by the way, is co-founder conflict. We brought them together. Jakarta was the first stop. And, it was a fantastic, the accelerator program in general was fantastic, but this program, this workshop that sat within, next to other things, it was rated like the highest rated part of the accelerator experience. So we said, okay, anomaly, let's, perhaps, some confluence of the stars aligned. Let's try it again. So we went to Bangalore, and again, it was the same response. And then we brought it to Sao Paulo. And at some point, anyway, today it's reached founders in about 70 countries through the accelerator. And now through the book, like any startup, any team in any startup-like environment can benefit from the tools that we've road tested. But we found that it wasn't because it was particularly mind-blowing as an experience. It was just that, it was a need that no one was addressing 9 years ago. And then B, founders don't get into this work of founding a company because they want to work on people issues. No one wants to do that. It's not the most exciting thing. It's not something you would post on, on X or on LinkedIn to say, like, hey, guess what? We're working on our people issues. You want to talk about your product and the number of people you're hiring and the markets you're entering. And so a lot of times these issues get swept under the rug, despite it being the biggest killer of startups.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a 20 plus years ago, I remember working on a project, and it was with a large restaurant chain and had gone through a number of different CEOs, and we were working with the CEO at this point, and he said, one of the things he said is that, the hard stuff is easy and the easy and the soft stuff is hard. And it kind of goes, you started the book. I love this at the start of the book. You used a quote from Bill Coughlin, right? From Sequoia Capital. And he said, it's kind of paraphrasing that. I'm sure he didn't paraphrase it, but he had it on his own. He said, engineering is easy. People are hard. And I found that great because it kind of, it epitomized the entire book for me. It kind of like, as I started reading it, it's like, oh, keep going back to that, it's like, this hard stuff is the easier stuff, and the soft stuff, that people stuff, is hard. So what is it about the people stuff that these founders are ignoring or missing, or why is it the hard part for them?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's because people think that engineering is this, and engineering is hard.
It was a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing. Engineering is not easy. I can, I will attest to that. Yeah.
But I think it's because many people think, well, I'm a person. Surely I can figure out the people stuff. Whereas engineering is something that's maybe more reserved for people who have a special kind of education. We write in that soon after we quote Bill, we talk about how, you can see it in our language somehow. Like we say stuff like, well, it's not rocket science, when we talk about these soft issues. The irony of that is that as a human civilization, we're incredibly good at rocket science. Like we can send someone to the moon and land within like 2 kilometers of our target landing spot. But with people, and, I love taking a jab at my academic friends only because I love them so much and I want to be more like them. But when you look at social science and you look at, R squared. We can decode that for your audience, but I'm sure that many of them understand that when you look at a correlational factor, R squared, and you see when you're studying social science and you see something that's above 0.5, which means that I can explain this outcome based on this one thing at a 50%, prediction rate, that's called a strong correlation. Whereas like physicists are like thinking, no, 99.99 R squared is what we need to go for. I mean, the reality is that the people stuff is hard because it's just a very complex, very difficult kind of topic. Whereas engineering and code, you can put your head down, decode, debug a code, and then it will work well the next day. It's not the same with people.
Yeah. Where does like good old emotional intelligence fit into all this?
I mean, that's, the thing I find about emotional intelligence, I think there are parts of it that I think have been misunderstood. I think when people say emotional intelligence, oftentimes what they mean is that I am self-aware, that I understand myself and maybe I understand the emotions of others. I understand kind of the social environment. Something that I have changed my mindset on in the recent few years is captured in this really nice pithy aphorism, which is know thyself and then get over thyself. And I just love that because it's a reminder of like, yes, we should be aware. Self-awareness is good, but also self-regulation is even better.
I love that fact. And I love that quote. So is this something, this idea that the people issues are hard, is this something that comes intuitively to new leaders, or do they sometimes have to go through the experience and basically live this world for a while before they grasp it? Or is there, is it across the board? Are there certain people who intuitively just understand, hey, I know I need to work on that, this is a big piece, and others who might take a while to get that hammered into their head?
So it's such a good point. I teach quite a bit. This is kind of my side. I have several side gigs, but teaching is one of them that I love so much. And generally I enjoy teaching grad school students who have a bit of that. There's a bit of scar tissue from the people stuff because it's something that you can't approach theoretically. It has, and so my undergrad students who I sometimes teach, if they've had like leadership roles in a club, in a student club, they will get it. They will understand it. But otherwise you need to go through that rich, that rite of passage before you realize, okay, actually this is hard. And the biggest supporters of the work that we've done are serial entrepreneurs because they get it. It's the first time entrepreneur who still hopes or is still so focused on the fact that it's the product that will win the day. it's the idea. They will fixate on the fact that the idea is the most important thing. When serial entrepreneurs realize it's execution, that's the most important thing. And that's where the people issues come into play.
I forget who it was in the book, and I'm just trying to remember this now, but you had talked about this relatively established startup that had come and they were doing really well and all of this kind of thing. And you and Josh were kind of going like, why are you here and focusing on this? And they said, well, because we're experienced enough to know that this is the important stuff. And that was, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it points to that fact that there, as you said, the serial entrepreneurs, the people who've gone through this, there's that realization that this is the stuff that if we don't get this right, it is going to lead to, much further problems either in the short term or definitely in the long term.
Yeah.
And again, you started the book. I thought this was really interesting with two different leadership styles. You kind of gave this example of one focused who is on kind of to the detriment, on results to the detriment of the team, kind of all, heads down. And then the other kind of, oh no, we're got to make sure that the team works in different pieces. And this was the other piece. So it's, what you kind of pointed to there is that, both have their positives, but both have their downfalls. And so is one style better than the other, or do we need to be a hybrid kind of approach?
Yeah, I love that. I think when people pick up a book about teamwork or about leadership, they tend to assume, oh, this is about like happiness, like let's optimize for happiness, right? And so the Bonfire Moment is not a happiness. It's not about, happiness at all costs.
Yeah.
Because you do want to create a place where you have high expectations and a high, big, bold goals, but then supporting the team really well through those goals. And so we talk to your point, Kurt, like we talk about these extremes, right? There's an extreme of this tyrannical leader who, disrespects people and understands that, we'll get the best out of people that way. And then you have the opposite extreme. And by the way, as I say this, you can think of all the many leaders you've worked with or know from the press. The other extreme is the leader who's very laissez-faire, who's very much like, look, like I am your coach and I believe in the promise and the potential of the human, of the human condition. And it's neither of those that are the right answer. Because, if you're optimizing for your goals, you might reach your goals, but you won't have a future beyond those goals because people leave you. And by the way, good people have options and they will leave. On the other end, if people are happy, they'll stay with you, but you won't reach your goals. And so you won't have a company to speak of, in the down run, later on. So you want to strike the right balance of, high expectations, but high support.
Why is it so difficult to do that?
So we talk about in the book, this idea of the trap of speed. And especially for companies who are under startup-like pressures, you have your investors knocking at your door constantly, asking about the next product launch. And it's a natural consequence of the trap of speed is that you will prioritize the short-term things. You will prioritize winning the short game. And then you deprioritize winning the long game. And in the book, we actually talk about, I love my behavioral science kind of nuggets here. We talk about hyperbolic discounting.
Yeah.
And how when benefits that come in the near term are valued pretty accurately, but as those benefits come in the longer term, we tend to apply a discount rate to those benefits, even if those benefits are just as important. And it just turns out that the people stuff, the toxic team environment, hiring well or sloppily, like all of that, the benefits of that tend to come a little bit, more in the long term than in the short term. When the research shows that actually a lot of your choices in the early days around the way you hire, the way you organize and control the work, a lot of that could predict your chances of, succeeding or failing, your chance of an IPO, your chance of growing your market capitalization. And, we talk about a lot of those really interesting studies. That one in particular from Stanford, about a decade ago now, really compelling stuff that just really points to the fact that while it's a long-term play, it's a long game here, it's really important stuff. And so we encourage founders to think of themselves not as kind of the the chief bricklayer, but to be the chief architect.
Yeah.
You're not the doer. You're kind of creating that environment where, you can grow and scale and become big and, and sustain your legacy.
So you started to talk about you talked about the trap of speed, and you identify 4 different traps as the first part of the book, which I thought they're fantastic. The trap of speed, the trap of the inner circle, the trap of the maverick mindset, and the trap of confidence. So, and this is going to be hard. This is my question here is one. Can you quickly summarize? You talked about the trap of speed. Can you summarize all of the other 3 for real quick, And then it's like asking like, which is your favorite kid, or which is the rowdy kid, right? And so do you have one that kind of like just you like, oh, this is the one I really like? Is there one that you can talk about like that? But first, let's do the quick summary of the other 3.
Okay. So the trap of the inner circle. Founders very oftentimes build a company with friends and family, because that's the only people who are willing to go with them at a time when they have nothing else other than a pitch deck. And that oftentimes creates a lot of instability and it tends to reject tough conversations. So that's the trap of the inner circle. The trap of the maverick mindset is a lot of these innovators come with very bold maverick ideas on how to disrupt industries, and they apply that same thinking to disrupting the organization or management practices, not realizing that technology can evolve really fast, but the human condition doesn't quite evolve nearly as fast. And so you're working with hardware that you need to honor and respect certain, universalities around. That's the trap of the maverick mindset. And the trap of confidence is there's a misconception among founders that as you get better at what you do, you tend to get more confident, when actually the data shows almost nearly the opposite, which is you are most confident at the beginning of the journey. And then there is this dip, which we affectionately call the bullshit zone, where your confidence is being hit. And then you realize you need to wear a mask and show people that it is not indeed a sign of future failure. But the trap of confidence is not realizing that that moment of self-doubt and insecurity is actually a signal of growth and not a signal of future failure.
All right. So now I'm going to ask you.
My favorite child.
Your favorite child.
I love them all, Kurt.
I know you do. But if you had to save one from the fire, right? You got the bonfire going and they're all running towards it. You got to grab one. You only have one hand. You can reach one. Which one are you pulling out?
I must say the trap of the maverick mindset, I think, is a message that isn't talked about enough in these circles. I think we talk a lot about, inner circles and a lot about, the issues of speed and the issues of confidence. But the maverick mindset, I think, is my favorite child, if I can say so. Don't tell the others.
We won't tell the other kids, but we'll.
That's
there
okay.
you go. So help us understand it. So given that the maverick mindset is one that, as you said, and this is, I kind of came to the same conclusion myself when looking at these. I've heard, speed. We know that like we go too fast. We're always trying to get the next thing. That inner circle, like, hey, we have groupthink and various different pieces, and confidence and imposter syndrome, which we can come back to and talk about that a little bit as well. But the maverick mindset was new. That was new to me. So what are some of the signs of that working inside of an organization? And then what are the things that we can do that maybe can help us overcome that mindset?
Yeah. So let me talk a bit about kind of just why it was worth calling this out. And then we talk about 5 myths of what it takes to really scale, or 5 myths that these mavericks tend to have. We can talk about the 3. I think that there are 3 that are probably most important to highlight here. A big part of this maverick mindset is a lot of founders just the thought of anything that sounds like old school reject. There's almost this like aversion just because, by the way, like we'll talk about music later, but I hate mainstream music just because it's mainstream.
Wow.
Because somebody made it big. It's like, ooh, no, can't do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I have the same thinking around even management. So I succumb somehow to this trap. But I think there's some beliefs that mavericks bring into management that tend to go overboard. So things like there's a real instinct we have around, there's an egalitarian instinct we tend to prefer. We want to think as every, and you'll hear this in like management jargon. Like you'll hear, well, ideas can come from anywhere. Egalitarian instinct. Or, some people will say, look, I'm just the leader here. I'm not. So we talk about three myths, right? So that they bring in. And by the way, I'm not an apologist for old school management. Like, I think we should definitely append some of that, but let's approach it with research and data, right? So the first one we talk about is the myth of scaling without hierarchy. There's a sense that hierarchy equals bureaucracy. And people conflate that quite often. And to be fair, they do grow in tandem. They tend to grow in tandem, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to grow in tandem. And there's a long history of this, right? You think of, Google's a good example. Google at some point when it had early on, it moved all its managers out of and had all its software engineers report into a single head of engineering. And they realized, and they undid that after like a week or two. They realized that the head of engineering was spending too much time approving expense reports and vacation leaves. And then later on, we realized actually managers are really good for other things, such as, supporting people's career development, breaking up large goals into smaller tasks that they can then work and focus on. Silos are not necessarily a bad thing, people. Like, silos actually create focus in an organization. There's interesting research that was done out of Wharton by Ronnie Lee and colleagues, and they look at the cost of an additional layer of management to certain goals. They studied gaming studios and they looked at two specific things. One is, will the games be less creative? That's the big fear, right? You create structure, hierarchy, then there's not a lot of cross pollination. And then two, they looked at commercial goals. Do they achieve the commercial goals? What they found when looking at, startups that bring on an additional layer of management, they find that yes, you actually see less creativity by about 1%.
Oh, huge. Yeah.
However, they gain a 14% bump in achieving their commercial goals in revenue.
Yeah.
And so you might say, look, like, we don't know what the true counterfactual of, if let's say that 1% dip in creativity didn't, like, could that have accounted for so much more in terms of revenue? But the point is, there's some amount of operational ambiguity that good managers are really useful for. And so you don't want to shy away from it. So I tell founders, don't be afraid of hierarchy.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. And then you can stop me, Kurt, if you want me to go deeper. But the second one, we talk about the myth of structural harmony.
Okay.
Which is, a lot of founders will come into this work and think, wow, my teams, they're fighting. There's a lot of conflict. Let's resolve the conflict. Let's do ropes courses and trust falls and, go out for beers, right? And I help leaders think about how you need to differentiate between personal conflict and structural conflict. Personal conflict will sound like personalities kind of clashing, but structural conflict might sound like the software team and the hardware team can't figure out how to approach, deadlines. The CEO and the CTO don't see eye to eye because the CEO wants things yesterday and the CTO is worried about tech debt. Sales and marketing can't get along. I tell leaders, look, some of the structural conflict is actually really healthy because you create an environment where that inbuilt design, that clash that's designed into those roles actually bring out the best in those functions. And so, like, don't try to resolve structural conflict. Sometimes you want to keep that going. The last thing, and we'll pause, is the myth of sustained heroics.
Yes, that's my favorite.
Great. Well, and the problem with heroics is when this hero swoops in and saves the day, and kind of it's the repeated thing. And by the way, in startups, like, it's all about heroics, especially in the early days. But we talk about how that becomes really dangerous down the line. So one big reason for that is this idea of you create single point dependencies and single points of failure in the organization. When that person leaves, or if that person is out on vacation or whatever else, then the team is left to scramble. But I think the more important thing, which is a bit more subtle, is this idea of the idea of overfunctioning behavior that I didn't coin that. It's something that psychologists have talked about. The problem with overfunctioning behavior and it's been studied in teams, it's also been studied in like partnerships and marriages. When you have an overfunctioning partner, what tends to happen is that partner tends to have a more toxic mindset towards the other people who aren't functioning at that same level. There's a sense that other people are lazy, incompetent, etc. Then what tends to happen is that the other people then to underfunction as a result, because then, that thing that needs to be resolved quickly, give it to Kurt and not to Tim. Sorry, Tim. Because Tim won't get it done.
It's actually the opposite, but we'll go with it. I'm okay with that, But
okay.
Just for everybody
assumes it's going to be Kurt that's going to get it done.
Oh, I love how I maybe touched on a really sore point here. I'm kidding. But the point is, like, you don't want to be caught in that cycle where there's over functioning focus on one person, and then as a result people then lean back and because we know that this person will come and save the day. Some career advice I got very early in my career, which has stayed with me somehow, is this idea of it's a law of thirds. 1/3 of your work is going to be amazing and joyful and really exciting, and like rock music is playing as you go about the work, right? As mentioned earlier. And then 1/3 is like, okay, not so exciting. And then there's 1/3 that's just grunt work. And every job has these thirds. And I think that's been really helpful for me to just manage my expectations. And then on that first third that is just joyful, like, how do I maximize? Like, how do I live in that as much as I can? And obviously you can't stretch that to 100% of your work, because certain things will fall through the cracks otherwise, right?
Yeah. But could you extend it to 40%? Could you extend it to 45%? And anything to, I love that just image of, it's a really visual third, a third. You can think of a pie chart or a line chart or whatever. And you could just take that and then say, you know what? It's not about like, you can't get to the 100%. We know that, right? We know that as humans. It's like, if you do that, you're delusional at some point. So, but what can you do to maybe decrease those other parts and increase that at least, a percentage point here, a percentage point there.
Yeah. 100%.
You brought up a really good example in the book too about like the recognition. So it was like, it falls and we're behind and we got to, do this great thing. And so then the manager, the leader, after you just spent, 24 hours, getting everything done, is like, all right, we got to go celebrate and take the team out now because they did this great thing. And so it's like, hey, there's a subtle motivational piece. It's like, well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to, kick the can down the road until the end. And then we get this big because we get rewarded by it. And I think that was really fascinating as well.
Yeah. One of my favorite like organizational psychologists is Bob Sutton here at Stanford.
Yeah.
And he has this idea he calls executive magnification.
Yeah.
Which is this idea that when you are in a position of power, first of all, like you are in a bubble. Like, let's just lay that out. I think leaders tend to want to believe that they don't step into a bubble the moment they have power over someone's hiring, firing, salaries, etc. But you are in a bubble. And so bad news will flow more slowly towards you. But executive magnification is this idea that, 9 out of 10 times when I am well rested, I've eaten, I'm in good spirits, I will say and do the right things. I will point the team in the right direction. And that 1 out of 10 times when you're hungry, sleep deprived, and just having a bad day, and you have this off the cuff comment, or you share this pie in the sky idea, like, let's do this. And the team runs off and spends and wastes so much time and effort and energy running. Like, that's so important to look out for. And in that story that you mentioned, Kurt, like, of course you want to celebrate someone who's hustling and then, you finally meet the deadline kind of last minute. Well, unfortunately, what happened there was that team realized that was what the leader wanted. We wanted to slack off through the week and then hustle on Thursday to meet the Friday deadline. and that behavior somehow got reinforced.
Yeah. Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard you say when we're talking about the heroic myth that early in the founding, early in the organization, there is the likelihood that some heroics are going to be needed. Did I hear you correctly in that?
Yeah.
And okay, and for those who are not familiar, who have not worked in a startup, maybe can you explain why that would be the case?
Because we are incredibly bad at forecasting just what it would take to get something from 0 to 1. This is really brilliant. I believe from Harvard, he was an economist, or from University of Chicago. He talks about the law of the hiding hand. And he studies all these large capex projects, like an airport or, bridges getting built. And he asks, why is it that these projects are always over budget and kind of exceed the timeline significantly? And he talks about how it's almost a prerequisite that you don't understand the true cost of an endeavor, because if you did, then you wouldn't even get started. So the project that actually started were because they underestimated what it would take. And at some point, the sunk cost fallacy kicks in, and then you're like, well, I've come this far, I might as well keep on going. And that's how you get, perhaps, the pyramids or massive structures.
Tim and I just, we were laughing because we just finished up a 3-year project that was they thought we were ridiculous, a history of behavioral economics, that at the beginning we were going, we'll extra plan this. We'll make sure that we cover this. It'll be a 6-month project. And 3 years later, it finally got done over budget and everything. But yeah, it's so true, right? Yeah. When you think about that. Let's move on, because I think there's some, obviously we're talking about some of the different hurdles and traps and the myths around that, but let's move on to talk a little bit about the Bonfire Moment experience itself. And you talk about 4 blocks, kind of parceling out that day-long experience into 4 main blocks. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what those blocks are?
Great. So you show up at 9 a.m., and the first block is what we call facing hard truths. And in this block, we invite people to actually reflect on how they've approached the work. We give them a very basic tool, a self-assessment tool, a quiz, if you will. I don't like calling it a quiz, but it lays out the 7 strategies that we've found in our research to be the effective ways by which founders around the world, have deployed. And they can then see against those 7 strategies. And these are things such as, how well do I position the vision to my team so that they are motivated to get it done? How much do I micromanage? How much do I manage my own kind of discouragement through the journey? We then highlight for them, here are the areas where you're likely not seeing this well, because we have data to show that certain things in that data set tend to have the biggest amount of blind spot with leaders, where when others then rate them, it tends to be the opposite rating. So that's the first one. The second one is then we invite people to write up what we call the user guide, which is a very simple tool, but really, really powerful, where we invite people to talk about, well, why am I here? What am I doing this for? What are my motivations? If you wanted to get the best and the worst out of me, how would you do that? If you need to give me feedback, how do I tend to prefer to receive feedback? If we get into conflict, how do we do that? If we were to forecast, possible failure down the line, like what are the biggest reasons why that might come about? And how do we mitigate some of that? It's at the second block. And people at that point are happy, laughing, they're getting to know each other. And then we hit them with the third block, which is about dropping the masks, where we talk about the trap of confidence. And we talk about how this point earlier that I made, that as you progress in your journey, the usual experience is self-doubt as opposed to as opposed to more confidence. And we talk about how we tend to wear masks in the process. And so we invite people to reflect on, well, what are the biggest insecurities I bring into this work? And what tends to be these masks that I wear as I do this? We talk about how there tends to be 3 masks that entrepreneurs, leaders tend to wear. It's optimism, strength, and detachment. Optimism is I'm feeling unsure. I'm going to burst through with sunshine energy to this team and talk about how everything's going to be great. I approach things with helpfulness. I'm very positive. That's the first optimism. The second one is strength, which is projecting prestige, achievement. I feel threatened. I show that I've succeeded many times before. The third is detachment, which is I want to show calm, independence. I want to be incognito. I don't want to show emotion. And so we invite leaders to then, around what we sometimes will encourage people to build a digital campfire because we don't want to burn anything. We have laptops out. We have a bonfire video playing, and we invite people, sometimes if it's culturally appropriate, over beers or wine or your choice of alcohol. We invite people to talk about that. And that's the third block. And then the fourth block is where we give people this list of 20 most common sources of conflict. And we invite people to say, teams to look through that list and say, what of these 20 things have we experienced already but haven't talked through, or are likely to experience and we should talk through them today? And we have them talk through what we would like to call the elephants in the room, where, these are the issues that we would love not to talk about because they're just not the most comfortable, fun topics to talk through. And so that's the day. So it's not a kumbaya day. It's a very much an intense, uncomfortable day. But teams emerge from this feeling like, wow, I understand you so much better, and I know how we can then be a much better team moving forward.
We also talk about finding rhythms in the blocks. Yeah. And, in finding your groove, we think about finding rhythms and grooves in life. And I was wondering, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the rhythms in the process?
I must say it was maybe a fancy word to just say, here's the agenda for the block. Okay. But we call it the rhythm of the block because it's, we want people to get in. We want people to feel like this is a simple process. The work that needs to be done isn't in organizing, and because the book just makes it so easy for teams to just pick this book up.
Yeah.
And
it's a guide. Yeah.
Yeah. To have their bonfire moment. And then we want them the hard work is focusing on filling in the blanks, filling in the frameworks, why am I here? Really going deep into that reflection and not having to worry about how do we maximize our day? How do we get through the day? Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because the book really does, the second part of the book is really, it's just this, way of facilitating this for your own team. So if, I recommend any leaders that are out there listening to this, and you talk about, your background is in tech startups and different things. But when I was reading this, I was going, this is applicable beyond a tech startup. I know you probably don't have the evidence, and so therefore you didn't probably talk about it. But everything that you're talking about here feels very much leadership. I'm working with a 150-year-old company that is bringing in acquisitions and new companies into the fold. And the same things are definitely apparent in that work. And so I would encourage anybody, and you have FAQs and what are the big things that are going to, potentially derail this, and how to look for this kind of detachment and how people show up. And so it's a very well kind of orchestrated piece. But one of the pieces that I think, you talk about in the book, and you've also, we talked a little bit about before we even got on air, is this idea about imposter syndrome and how pervasive it is. And you talked about this in the bullshit zone and other pieces of this, but can you talk a little bit more about imposter syndrome and because imposter syndrome has there's some research on that, and there's a general, there's also a kind of cultural or the kind of meme of imposter syndrome that's out there. I think you said you have a little bit different take.
Yeah. So first of all, I think in the corporate world, but also especially in the startup ecosystem, I think what makes it particularly worse is there's a big brag culture that's been created. And this is really a mix of, what investors want to see. It's also the 0 to 1 gig. When you're building something from nothing, you really got to sell it really hard, right? And then we talk about in the book this idea that psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, which is this idea that if I believe that a certain group thinks a certain way, then I will shape my behavior that then sustains that belief. So in this case with startup founders, you go to any startup conference, Kurtim, it's like everyone is crushing it. It's like everyone is expanding, is hiring, is raising more money. And then you look at the data and it's like, surely either everyone, the 10% that's successful have all gathered in this one place in this one time.
The one conference with all the 10% that are being successful.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
Or the other alternative, which is we're all just making shit up. And and you can imagine that you go into these environments and then you come home thinking, well, if everyone's crushing it and I'm not, like, am I the only one that's not crushing it? And so it sustains this idea. And I think what's particularly unfortunate about this is people who, I think there's this so imposter syndrome was first studied among high-performing women in the maybe 60s or 70s. And I think to some extent there was a belief that sustained that this was a unique experience of a certain gender or a gender stereotype of women. What the more recent research is showing is that it's turning out that actually, people who align to this male stereotype tend to actually experience it just as bad. What's different is that because of the norm of the male stereotype is to hide a lot of these insecurities. I mean, this is the one thing about the male norm that has really hurt masculinity significantly. People don't talk about it. And so this pluralistic ignorance is even heightened among men when we know, and heightened among founders. And we know that if you look at the data around, suicidal ideation or hospitalization because of mental illness, substance abuse, it's so much higher among founders, of whom many of them are men. And so we talk about in that chapter on the trap of confidence about how it's so important for everyone to have no bullshit relationships where you can just be completely, yourself. And, create, I think about rivers and rivers that are, when you have a river that is dammed up or that, where there's a lot of blockage, a lot of the sediment and a lot of the dirt piles on. But the moment you unblock a river and you let it flow, you actually get cleaner water as a result. And there's something about being able to just share and, being vulnerable to other people that really just in itself already helps.
Yeah.
What would you like to say about your personal issues with, that you struggled with?
Yeah.
We could do it. You talked about your own bonfire circle, right? The bullshit circle piece in there. And both of you did. So,
So whenever we run that third block of the Bonfire Moment, we go first. I go first as a facilitator of that workshop. I'll go first and share my own journey. And I typically talk about my own journey with the immigrant tax that I've experienced in being a serial immigrant now 4 times over. And a big part of my insecurity coming to the US the first time 18 years ago was feeling completely fumbling through my words. I speak several languages because of where I lived and grew up and worked in the Philippines. And so it was hard to stick to like a single track language. And I come to the US and you have all these Americans so eloquent and, able to just express their ideas very easily. And that really got to me. And I remember years after that initial experience in the US, whenever I would deliver a talk or a workshop, my eye would quickly scan for especially the white Americans in the room. And I could feel like viscerally my defenses would just rise up. And that was like a big part of my journey of insecurity and self-doubt all along the way. And I know for a fact, a lot of founders kind of look at their credentials and think, well, I didn't study in Stanford or Harvard. I didn't work for big, Google or Microsoft or Amazon. And surely a VC won't care, to hear my pitch. But my message to them is like, go do it anyway.
Yeah. You talked about, as part of that section in the book, you talked about just working harder, right? That you would dig in and just like, that was your kind of counterance to some of that insecurity. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah. There was a moment as a young 20-something-year-old where I told myself, if another person who grew up in America worked on the same goals, they will get there faster. And so the only thing I could control is working harder than to outwork everyone else. And I think, for good or for bad, that's been my work ethic as a result of that insecurity.
To this day, are you still living under the weight of that mantle?
I think I have learned that I am now in a position of power where I can actually make things more equitable for other people, and I can help alleviate a lot of that immigrant tax that people in my community tend to carry. But there's something about that work ethic that has stayed with me. And my wife was just joking last night, like, oh, Martin's not an individual, he's a multivisual because he teaches, he has a job, he's written this book, and he's kind of living multiple lives, like in the most, positive way, to be clear.
Okay, good.
It's interesting. Tim and I have grooved on, so I think we have a similar bent, right? This idea that we kind of just can work through these things and we take on many things. And so we're talking about this project, this Behavioral Grooves, is a side project for us. And then we took on this other, history of behavioral economics. They thought we were ridiculous. And that is a side project of a side project. And yet we're still doing it. We're trying to write a book, right? And so
Amazing.
All of these things. And the issue for us is, and Tim, I don't want to speak for you, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but the issue for us is I can work harder, but I don't always work effectively in that manner. And then I get mad because I feel like we shouldn't have taken 3 years to do that side project. We've been working on a book for even longer than that. And we're still not at a point where we're going, oh, we got it. We're going to be, just another couple months. No, we're still pounding shit out. And so,
I relate so much to that, Kurt. And I think that's part of the delusion, right? Of the hyper productive person. It's like, surely the downsides, I can manage the downsides, but I got to push hard because the upsides are just, incredible. But yeah, I don't know. I can't say I have good advice for that. It's funny. Over the spring break with my kids, I picked up this book called, by Cal Newport. It's a new book called Slow Productivity. And I was showing my brother, yeah, this is my book. He's like, how funny. It's still about productivity.
Yeah, there might be slow in the title, but did you see the other word there? Yeah.
That's right. I don't know what. Yeah. We are talking with Martin Gonzalez about his new book with Joshua Yellen called The Bonfire Moment. Bring your team together to solve the hardest problems startups face. I see an acoustic guitar in the background, and I'm curious a little bit about, was there any music on a playlist while you were writing the book?
I would like to say it was rock music constantly, feeling like I was crushing it each and every time. The reality is that Imposter Syndrome hit us very hard all through this process.
Yeah.
And this is where I say my editors have been such wonderful guides because they're like, no, this isn't shit on a page. Thank you. So that guitar is more aspirational than it is a symbol of real skill. But
That's okay.
I know the intros of Eric Clapton songs, but just the intro.
Okay, great.
And I just love picking it up every now and again to play.
That's fantastic. So, did you listen to music while you were writing the book?
So I listen to a lot of focus study music. I sometimes listen to Mozart and Beethoven depending on my feel of the moment, but it can't have lyrics. I can't focus otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. We asked that question to a lot of people, and there's a bunch of people that come back and say, sure, listen to music's great, but it can't have words, especially if I'm writing words. That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned earlier that you don't like mainstream music.
Yes.
So what kind of music? Yeah.
Look, when I was in high school, boy bands became such a big thing, and I was the first to say I am not up for boy bands. The music I loved growing up, though, were the ballads, were Boys to Men and baby
Yeah.
face. It's all the like I love me a sappy song. It's I don't know, gets me going.
You don't have to be apologetic in the least. Not a bit. So if you were stuck on a desert island for a year and you have to, and you can only bring 2 musicians with you, and actually not the musicians themselves, but their catalog of music.
Okay.
Who do you bring?
That's a good one.
This is not a go to your grave answer, by the way.
Yeah.
Your facial expression is really stressing over this, and I just want to.
There are many good ones. So I would say the Unplugged album of Eric Clapton is something I come back to time and time again. That is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
The Unplugged, if you remember back in the day, there was this whole
MTV
Unplugged.
Oh, yeah.
It was a great
when he
great
completely reworked songs like Layla and and just re-envisioned them. Yeah, it was fantastic. Agreed.
That was really good. Jack Johnson every now and again.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go. I like those 2. Those would be 2. I'd take Eric Clapton's, mix. I mean, and Tim, if you took Eric Clapton, does that mean like any of his partnerships? So did he play on some of the Beatles songs and didn't, so when you get
he was
that
on
part of that catalog?
While My Guitar Gently Weeps with George Harrison. Of course, he was in Cream. He was in Derek and the Dominoes.
Yeah.
So he's got a legacy of, lots and lots of work. So you don't have to just take the Unplugged album.
That's the one you'd listen to most, but yeah, we
right.
could get the whole catalog. All right. Well, cool.
Yeah.
Martin Gonzalez, thank you. This has been super informative, super fun. We encourage all of our listeners to go out, get the book, and thank you.
This was super fun. Thank you.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Martin, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our burning hot brains.
As in like a bonfire kind of burning hot brain?
Burning hot bonfire brains. That's what I should have said. Burning hot bonfire brains. We get, well, okay. I'll dig into this.
Okay.
Bonfire moments, right? I think there are times where, and we talked about this before going on the air, right? It's like I was saying the last few weeks, and long story behind that, but I just have not had bonfire moments from a thinking perspective that I've had the kind of foggy lack of clear thinking and hard time to really get moving on things. And I think the bonfire is really this idea of, no, we have that in our thinking as well as within our organizations. Anyway, sorry.
Well, let's make sure we talk about that. Let's make sure that we get to that. But first, if it's okay with you, Kurt, I'd like to start with this idea that founders oftentimes have superhero complexes, right?
What?
That and you as a founder, right, have I've seen you with so many. Yeah, in fact, you're wearing your cape this morning. I think that's great. But I know that because the founder has the vision and the idea for that super cool product or service, you still don't have to be a superhero. You don't have to be everything to everybody. And I think that's a really important factor that Martin points out. And of course, by the way, Martin also backs it up with evidence-based research.
Yeah. And the hard part though, is that it's the perception, right? And we hear the stories. We hear the stories of the founders who pull these insanely hours and, swoop in and do all of these things. But you're absolutely right. And Martin is absolutely right. Is this idea that, that's not really what makes an effective leader. What makes an effective leader doesn't entail having to be a superhero. And there's an aspect of this, and I see this in some side, not just with startups and founders, but I see this in the work I do with corporations, is that sometimes there's cultures where they live with fires, right? There's always a fire. Yeah. There's always a fire. There's always a fire. And there's a type of individual who thrives in that environment.
Right.
That there is something about, I worked until 1, 2 a.m. in the morning for 4 nights straight to get this done. And then you get the accolades because you saved the day, and you get the adrenaline rush from that and the dopamine release from all of the recognition that you get. And then you go the next time, and then it's another fire, and you rise to that occasion again, and you do it over and over and over again, because there's a little bit of addiction to that need to be the superhero.
Yeah. So it goes beyond just the idea of adding value or needing to be seen or the striving for significance story. Like, I get where all of that has a part to play, but you're kind of talking about sort of the more toxic side of it, which is addiction, and then what can happen, and not just the way that you see yourself, but how you see your teammates. Like, well, they're not putting in what I'm putting in. They're somehow inferior to me because I'm the one who's getting all of this stuff done. I'm the one that's working until midnight or 2 or whatever.
And when we think about scaling a business or having a business that actually thrives, that we're maximizing people's potential, those superhero kind of moments shouldn't be there. You don't want to have a superhero moment, right? You want the system to be working smoothly so that you don't have fires that you have to put out, that you, and granted, founders and startups, there's a lot to be going on, and you're usually under-resourced in a variety of different things. But even then, you should have an understanding of what are those key priorities and what you need to do, and how does your team help you get there, and how do you leverage the team's strengths, which is what Martin's talking about with, all of this emotional intelligence and building a team that collaborates together and works well together. So
I think that's a great example. That also kind of leads me to the imposter syndrome, and this is something that all of us suffer from in some degree, right? But it's very real for founders and leaders alike. So how do we sort of deal with imposter syndrome? And I think some of it is, let's just acknowledge that it exists maybe even more strongly with founders, because they have been the generators of the super cool idea. Now it's being built into something, and there's this doubt. Yeah. This inherent doubt, like, is it really all me? And of course, it shouldn't all be them. Because as you just alluded, process should be a key part of it. Like, you build a hierarchy so that you have an organization to do things that the founder couldn't do alone.
There's and we've talked about this before, but there's an activity that I use with groups when I'm working with them sometimes, called the electronic maze. It's basically this 6x9 carpet that looks like a checkerboard that has these 6x9 squares on it. Some of the squares, when you step on them, beep, and some of them don't. And there's some rules that you play, and you get the team, and they have to find their way through via a non-beeping path. And there is this,
and the beep is the error, right?
Beep is the error. So you're finding you step on a square, it doesn't beep. You step on another square, and you're trying to get from one end to the other end. And what's really interesting is when you think about this, is the stakes go, the perceived stakes go up the further that you get into the maze. So in other words, one of the rules that you have is you have to retrace your exact path back off of the maze once you hit a beeping square. And so you have to retrace that path back that so I might have taken 3 steps, 4 steps, 8 steps, 10 steps, right? Because it weaves back and forth through this piece. And what's interesting is that when you get further out into the maze, that pressure of the kind of angst that people feel about stepping on a beeping square is heightened.
Yeah.
This and the fact of the matter is there's only so many squares on this carpet. Yep. And every time you step on a non-beeping square or a beeping square, you're getting more information. That information is the same information that you got at the very beginning with the very first step, and it beeped, and all right, I got a beep there. I know that's not a good one. Now I've gone 8 steps in, 9 steps in, and I beep. I got more information. It's that same piece. The only thing is I've gotten so far. And it's kind of the same thing, I think, with what Martin's saying about these founders is like, we started this company and yeah, I can make these mistakes, but we get over them because we're fast, we're nimble and different things. But all of a sudden you start having success. And then you get investors involved and you get, more investors involved.
Yes.
And all of a sudden the stakes seem to rise. And that angst that you feel because you're further out into this maze and now stepping on that beeping square, it's not the end. It's just part of this piece, but it feels like that pressure is so much more. And I think that is what's happening a lot in this, and that imposter syndrome of, if I stepped on a beeping square before, it wasn't that big a deal. Now, everybody will know. Everybody's looking at me, and yeah, it's just there.
Well, and this is the part that I think is really interesting when you brought up the investors and stakeholders, and the company starts getting bigger, because the matrix that when you run it in workshops is a team activity. So there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people standing around the maze while one person is walking across
exactly
each of those carpet squares, and they're all being very careful and very focused, and they're taking all this information and they are watching you. So
yes.
that striving for significance and adding value is really heightened at that moment, right? And this is what the founders are feeling.
Yes.
when they've got all the backers and the board, and every single step of the way just becomes so intense, and so that imposter syndrome becomes really natural. Like, maybe I'm not the guy.
Well,
maybe this is all made up.
And part of this goes back to pluralistic ignorance, which, and again, for listeners who may not know, pluralistic ignorance is a social psychology phenomenon where people believe others have different opinions than their own, even though their own opinions are different in private. And so another way of saying that is, hey, I have this stated thing, but, I think everybody else thinks something different, even though I do. And it's just this kind of mismatch of different pieces. Did I state that right?
It's a total mismatch. It's like, no, nobody believes what I believe.
Yeah.
And yet,
so I will state what I think others believe, when in fact everybody is believing my thoughts that's going on in the back of my head that aren't stated out there, right?
Exactly,
and so, yeah, and it happens, right? It happens in groups all the time. It happens in schools, workplaces, teams, friend groups. Yeah,
it's prevalent, and that can really get in the way of making good decisions, of leveraging the variety and diversity of the team. And I get back to this idea that the founder doesn't have to be the only one to solve all the problems.
Yeah.
Right. Because they can't. They have a great idea. They have the generation to continue to focus and to continue to hone, but you've got different people in the organization to help with that.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'd want to encourage founders, especially
leaders.
Leaders.
This is, and granted, Gonzalez, Martin was talking about, most of his research is with founders and kind of startups and different things. Yeah. But what I found is that the insights that he has and that he brings forward in the book really pertain to many leaders across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. That's good stuff. How about if we talk a little bit about emotional intelligence?
Well, I have no idea what that is. So,
see, this is the other thing that was going on in my mind. Should we be talking about self-awareness? Dr. Nelson?
I'm not self-aware either, so I can't, I don't know what that means. Like, I'm supposed to be, you got to tell me, am I? Yeah. No, it's, I think it's really important. And this is something that Martin brings up again, is this idea of understanding that it's not just all about the operations, that when you are dealing and building a company, you're dealing with people. And when you're dealing with people, we have emotions. And this idea that the emotional side of the business is just as important, if not sometimes more important, than the technical operational side of things. And I see this. Again, this isn't just in startups. This is across the board. I work with leaders who are fantastic at the operational side of things. They got processes down. They go do Gantt charts. They got, all of the things that I don't understand about getting the work done. And their people are miserable because they're not attaining to the emotional side, the emotional intelligence that you need.
Well, isn't part of this, especially in tech startups, and I think Martin spoke to this really beautifully. He said that technology can evolve really fast, but the human condition doesn't quite evolve nearly as fast. Right?
It doesn't at all.
Not at all. So, just having that take a breath kind of approach is really, really important.
Yeah. And he also said, and I quote here, humans are like hardware that you need to honor and respect certain universalities. Did I say that right?
These universalities. This is a cool part of it. It's like, remember that humans have been around for a long time and we've been evolving very, very slowly. But we kind of have our own hardware system that's not like the companies. It's not the stuff that we're building.
And so when we take the emotional factor in, the idea of being, as a leader, and we've talked about this, all eyes are on you, right? And so you are under a magnifying glass. And so the inappropriate sigh, the words that might not be encouraging, the understanding that you picked the same person over and over and over again to give accolades to and not anybody else, the idea of giving certain people prime jobs and others you just know they're just doing the same thing over and over again. It's all of those emotional pieces that we respond to. And if we don't understand how people in our teams respond and what we can do as leaders to ensure that we are getting and optimizing and maximizing their motivation, their engagement, all of those factors, then we're missing a huge component. And that is going to lead, doesn't negate the fact that you might still succeed, but you're going to succeed in not because of that, but despite that, right?
Yeah. Well, this is also part of the maverick mindset that he talked about. And this whole idea that leaders and founders especially, have this idea like, I don't have to worry about the people. All I have to worry about is the technology, or some of my favorite myths. I think we talked a little bit about this idea that I'm going to reject everything that's old school because I have a new organization. I have a new concept.
I'm going to do things differently.
That's right. All those companies in the past, they did it wrong. I'm doing it right.
and there's a part of that is great, right? But there's also a part that there's an aspect of maybe structure and culture and management layers and different pieces that
it's okay.
Is okay. And it's done because of, again, that hardware that we have as humans. And if you're going to scale, there are certain things that work really well as a small, nimble team where everybody knows each other and you trust each other and you have those interpersonal relationships. Then the organization starts to grow. And then you don't have all of those same components. And not saying that you can't change that, but there are some things that, hey, we know the rejection of something just because it was done by others in the past is a foolish kind of piece. And make sure you're doing optimizing the stuff that you're doing.
Yeah. People are complex. Right. So let's respect that. Let's just respect the fact that the emotional intelligence and self-awareness of the leaders is just as critical to the development of the organization as the well-being of the people who are actually doing the work.
So a couple pieces of this, right? So you already talked about reject anything that's old school. I think one other thing that Martin said is, and this is fantastic, is this idea that, again, many leaders want this egalitarian kind of thing. They bring in this like, oh, hierarchy's bad.
My company's new. Yeah.
Egalitarian good. Yeah.
We're going to do it differently.
But he brought in this idea that management layers bring a 1% drop in creativity from his research, yet a 14% bump in commercial success.
Yeah.
Which is amazing. So I will take a 1% drop in creativity for a 14%, bump in commercial success.
I think that, I think just about anybody would. Yeah.
So, silos are bad, but they're not. They are and they're not. And so you use them, develop them right. I think that's the big piece. And as you said, people are complex. And so organization, and you bring people together, and that complexity doesn't get simplified. It gets, magnified. So there you go.
Yeah. Can we talk one last thing that I wanted to talk about was the law of thirds. I was really, really pleased when Martin brought this up late in our conversation. And I just thought that this was really good advice just to think about what work life is like, especially when you're having a difficult day. And just to repeat, a third of the work is going to be amazing. A third of the work is going to be just okay. Yeah. And then a third of work, I think he used the word grunt. It's going to be grunt work, right? When you're literally grunting. But like, this is a fantastic way. Actually, I think it's a fantastic way of thinking about it, because if you're going to have a third that is grunt work that you simply can't ignore, you can't get around it, you can't change it, it's just going to be grunting. Let's actually just put that on the side and say, okay, a day or so out of every week is going to be grunt work. I'm going to just not enjoy it. I'm not going to enjoy the labor of it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But what about the middle part? What about the middle third that is just okay? Maybe that's where we could actually spend some time to maybe just make that a little bit better.
Well, again, if we're trying to find our groove, and we think about groove as being this way to optimize our overall well-being in life, and if this rule of thirds is true, let's minimize that third grunt work if we can, right? Can we outsource that? This is all the Tim Ferriss things and stuff, right? Can we outsource some of that? But you can't do that all the time. There's always going to be a part of that, right? And if we can expand the amazing part, right? If we can do more of that, if we could just live our lives off of this podcast, Tim, it would be fantastic. If, all of a sudden we got a huge sponsor, anybody out there wants to sponsor us for, $1 million a year, we're great. Here we go. But
or more.
More. I like that. But this idea of taking that middle, and it's the okay stuff. Well, can we do things to make the okay better? Yeah. Can we get into a groove around that? Can we make it a game? Can we break it down into smaller bits? Can we bring in some social aspect to it? What can we do about that middle third to make the okay better than okay? Mm-hmm. And to get into a groove with it. And you said, even a day of like the grunt work, and maybe it's not even like a specific day. If that works for you, great. Yeah. If you want to do that, but maybe it's like, hey, I know how my energy level throughout the day works. And so I want to be doing this amazing stuff at the beginning and maybe at the end to do a peak, end kind of thing for every day. And then, I want to do the grunt work, like when I'm at my, whatever time works best for you. So it's like, figuring out the groove of your day and the rhythm that you need to get in order to make sure that this is the best possible way, and that the grunt work doesn't become so much that it just brings everything else down.
This is kind of a pie in the sky recommendation that I have, but I remember some research from Victoria Schaefer where she was looking at some unpleasant experiences and some pleasant experiences. And what would it be? And identified, guess what? Going to the dentist, unpleasant experience. Just about universally unpleasant, right? But going to a spa, pretty much universally a pleasant experience. And so the question that the research question she had was, could going to the spa after I go to the dentist enhance the experience of the dentist? Like, would it make going to the dentist a little less bad? And the answer is no. It doesn't.
Damn it! I thought for sure I was gonna have to because it's gonna be like, hey, I get to go to the spa every 6 months because all right.
Don't. So her research showed, don't go to the spa on the same day as you go to the dentist. Just do the dentist like on Monday, and then maybe on Wednesday go to the spa. Like separate it. Actually make the savoring that goes along with the enjoyable experience better. So here's my recommendation. If there is a way to organize your work so that you could do all the grunt work like on one day or 2 days of the week, and then you have the rest of the week to be focusing on the okay stuff or the amazing part, like that could be more fulfilling just in the experience itself.
I was just thinking that the spa experience sucked because you were going in there and they couldn't understand you because they're asking you, I'm sorry, what? Where do you want the massage on?
Because of the Novocaine in your mouth?
Yeah, because you just can't talk because there's that. And I thought that was why the spa was not good. No. Yeah. Hey, you were at CB25. CBO 25 last week up in Toronto.
Yeah.
And I know this isn't there, but there was a comment that you said that you heard that reminded you of this law of thirds. So I want to make sure that you talk about that. So
yeah. So one of the colleagues at the CBO 25, which is the chief behavioral officers, the top 25 chief behavioral officers in the world, got together at the University of Toronto. And Dilip Soman was there. It was just very cool. But there was this complaint that that behavioral science ought to be like part of the strategy of everything in the organization. Like there was a little bit of discussion about this rather pie in the sky ideal that, oh man, like behavioral science is so important. And if you're going to have a behavioral science function, it needs to report to the CEO so that it's integrated into the entire organization. And there's a lot of friction around that because a lot of times, it just feels like sometimes you get and this was my experience at Truist. Sometimes you just get a call and they just want 20 minutes or 30 minutes of, can you just advise me on this? Can you just give me a sprinkle of behavioral science?
It is the way that I like frame this email the right way, Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes like you just get brought into a project late and then it's like, oh man, how can we bring behavioral science into a project when we're already halfway through it, right? So those aren't optimal situations. And one of the colleagues there at the CBO 25 said, well, wait a minute, why fight it? Why not just have like 3 different levels of offerings? Why not say, we're going to just do an input level. We're just going to have the sprinkles of a quick advisory call. It's 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, just to bring in some ideas.
A meeting to share some insight, right? So it's like, we'll schedule an hour. You tell me what's going on. I'll give you my best thoughts within that hour, right?
Yeah. Like make that a service. Make that part of the offering that you're making. And then the second one would be like the seat at the table offering. So, okay, so you get brought in, you're late in the project, you're not central to the strategy, but you have something to contribute. So make the best of that. Yeah. Make the best of what that situation is and make that an offering in and of itself, right? And then the last one is where you're actually driving the process, where the behavioral science strategy is really first and foremost. It's the beginning. It's the impetus for the project. It's the catalyst because of some research insight or something that's been observed. And I guess all of this kind of gets back to this idea of this when we're talking about the law of thirds. Yeah. And we've got the amazing stuff at the top and the grunt work at the bottom, but that okay part in the middle. Maybe part of the okay part in the middle is, and you mentioned this, I think you even said, adjust your mindset.
Yeah.
Maybe part of adjusting the mindset is adjusting the offering. How do I come to the organization? How do I come to work and say, instead of pushing back against, oh, geez, they just want me to go through this call today. They've only given me an hour. The project's already deep into whatever they're working on, and they just want an hour's worth of insight from me. And that's not, I want to drive the project. It's like, no, stop fighting it. Just kind of go with, maybe there's some value in just going with, okay, I'm just going to give some input. It's going to be a quick advisory call.
And that, I think, is a wonderful way of thinking about things, because we so often get hung up in this idea that my value is associated with the impact that my work has. And sometimes your value is just being able to provide a simple service to people that they need in the moment. And that's okay. Now, granted, you don't want to do that all of the time, but if you can adjust your mindset around what you're contributing and how that contribution helps, this goes back all of the time. And again, I hate to keep using references to myself, but I remember when I first started out 30 years ago, and I would do team building sessions, right?
Yeah.
And I would get mad when I would realize that, or not mad, like I would feel like my session wasn't a success if I didn't get 100% of the people just fully embraced around, maybe not 100, but the majority of people embraced around, this is great. I learned so much, now we're going to operate as a better team. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen
not all the time. Not all the time. No.
There were maybe a third. I mean, actually, it's more like a 20% of the time, right? And then there were 60% of the time where it was just okay, and then 20% of the time where I fucked up and it was just bad, right? But there was a shift I made at one point where I'm going, you know what? This is a success if I can get 1, 2, 3, 4 people who get an insight on this that they can take away, and it improves how they come into work, that it improves their next week of working with the team, or helps them become a better performer, whatever it would be. And I don't need to get all 100 people, ramped up. I can just make a slight difference, and that's important. And by just having that shift in my mindset, it changed the way I approach. And I think I actually was better because I wasn't striving to make sure that everybody had it. And the actual work was better because of that.
That's a great example. That's a great way of thinking about it, Kurt.
So should we wrap it up on that?
Well, do you have anything else? Did you?
Well, I have a ton more, but I think, we're okay. Let's wrap it up. Cool conversation with Martin. And I love that he brought insights into our thinking about leadership. I love our guests. I love our research guests. I love those. Really, really love those. I really love our research guests when they are applied to business and some of the work that we do with organizations. Because, the rest of our life, that's a lot of what we do. And it's part of what I love is being able to take these insights that we know from the science, but apply them into our real everyday world. And that I just love. So.
Yeah, these are evidence-based opinions. They're our observations. They're evidence-based, right? And we love the scientific process, and we like the idea of relying on evidence rather than just opinions. And being able to come to this conversation with what really helps founders and corporate leaders become successful, what really actually contributes to their successes, it was invaluable, and I'm really, really grateful for that. And Martin was a great guest.
And so we hope this week, Groovers, you're able to go out, debunk some of your own myths, and use these insights to go out and find your groove.